For millions of years, the skies were the exclusive domain of the birds, the bats, and the butterflies. For millennia, men have watched them, envied them, and sought to emulate them. But it's only in the last century that we've succeeded in joining them in the adventure of powered flight. In that short time, flying has evolved from a perilous enterprise to the safest mode of transport the world has ever seen. We owe much of that to the developing technology, but it's also due to the skill and training of those who operate the planes, the pilots. The modern-day commercial pilot is a very different person to those early pioneers. Aviator, navigator, meteorologist, engineer, and team manager. The contemporary pilot needs all of these skills to operate in the modern aviation industry. In this episode, we continue to follow our flight cadets at the Skyborne Airline Academy to their basic flight qualification, and then examine the further experience and training required to transform them into a first officer for a modern commercial airline.
My name's James, I'm an integrated cadet with Skyborne, and today what I'm going to do is just give you a little insight into what it's like during the flying phase of training here at Skyborne. So just out for a walk this morning in sunny Cheltenham. As you can see, the weather's looking great. The flight this afternoon is at 1:30, so there is a slight chance of thunderstorms later on, so we'll keep an eye out on those. But what I'm planning to do is just give you an insight into the planning, the processes that we have to do, the flight itself, and then how we debrief, and then anything else that we get up to as cadets here in Cheltenham. So as you can see, the weather's looking good. Flight's been pushed back to 4 o'clock. Which should help bring the temperature down a little bit, as it's quite warm at the moment. But the flight is going to be a local IFR route, so we're going to plan to go to Cardiff. There'll probably be a diversion or a simulated failure in that. Fly back to Gloucester, and then we've got a few different approaches, some general handling, and some holds to do as well. So it should be quite a good flight, and yeah, looking forward to taking you with me. So just currently one of our DA40 aircraft. So as you can see, the cockpit is very similar to what we have in the DA42, which makes it a kind of seamless transition onto the twin, which comes in handy once we finish the SEP training and start training towards our CPL, which hopefully for us will be in the next couple of weeks. Hey guys, so just debriefed, so back at the centre now. So the flight was really good, so we did an RNAV approach and NDB approach as well, which are both first time for me. So both went really well, so happy with how they went, and the debrief was all good as well. So there's a few points to take away, but looking forward to implementing them in the next lesson. So now we're going to head back to the house, see what the guys are up to, and yeah, hopefully do something this evening.
Once they have completed their training courses and passed all the exams either by the integrated or modular route, pilots will now hold their basic Air Transport Pilot's License, usually referred to as ATPL. This is the basic commercial pilot's qualification, but unfortunately does not mean that they are quite ready for their first job. There are still a couple of hoops they need to jump through, and their air transport pilot's licenses are sometimes referred to as a frozen ATPL until they have completed further training. Up to this point, the student pilots have been flying on their own in single pilot small aircraft. Now they need to prepare to fly in a large jet aircraft and as part of a team.
At Virtual Aviation Flight Training, we offer the APS MCC course, so that's the Airline Pilot Standard Multi-Crew Cooperation course. So up until students come to us, they've been learning to fly aircraft, it's been single crew. When they come here, they're really learning how to operate as part of a two-person crew in an airline environment. So using our simulator that we've got here, they will fly scenarios and learn how to interact, communicate, make decisions and operate as part of a two crew rather than the one-person single pilot operations they've been used to. It's just under 3 weeks, which includes a week of ground school, and then they move on to the simulator phase, which is 40 hours, so 4 hours a day over 10 days. We were the first organisation in the UK to get the APS approval. We've offered MCC courses for a few years now, and that's always been an enhanced MCC. The minimum requirement for an MCC is 20 hours. We always felt that we needed to offer more than that, so it was always a little bit more. And we also offered the Jet Orientation course, the JOC course, but that was always an unregulated course. Whereas under APS, the MCC and the JOC element are combined in this blended course. So we're finding we're getting much better results with the APS and preparing students for airline life.
The Multi-Crew Cooperation course has been the most recent fundamental innovation in commercial pilot training and came about as a result of the scrupulous examination of air accident investigations. Retired airline captain Dave Smith qualified as a commercial pilot in 1974. At that time, the fundamental structure of the training course was similar to the present day, and also in those days, there were more crew on the flight deck.
Having so many members of the crew in a cockpit during sort of the post-war times, something in the modern era we train on is multi-crew cockpit management, yes. So training with multiple people working the aircraft. We call it MCC. It's all being integrated nowadays into something called APS, where they put the jet orientation course and the multi-crew together. But essentially it's effectively the same thing in the modern era. Was multi-crew something people thought about when you trained?
Unfortunately not. No, I was at the end of I was flying with some people who had flown during the Second World War, and it was still very much the captain's the boss, what he says goes, and then there was the hierarchy of the co-pilot. If you were flying for BOAC, then you'd have got the navigator and the flight engineer, but it was or if you were flying the Trident, then there were two co-pilots, but one was always senior to the other, and there was a definite hierarchy. And you might very politely inquire as to what the captain was doing, but only very politely, and if he told you mind your own business, then you minded your own business. Okay. Yes, multi-crew cooperation didn't exist. It came in, of course, as a result of some unfortunate accidents, and it's great. It's what should have been there, but like anything, it had to evolve.
Okay. I know how to do it. So back in the days when you were flying in the earlier periods, perhaps when you were a first officer, were there times where you sat at the controls thinking, hold on a minute, something's not quite right?
Yes, certainly. And you voiced your concerns, as I said, in a polite way. You were not encouraged to voice your concerns. Obviously, if I had ever felt that what the captain was doing was going to kill me, then I would have intervened. But it was not encouraged, not like it is nowadays. And as I said, it's evolved through a series of accidents whereby they could tell from the cockpit voice recorders that the conversations between the captain and first officer, the multi-crew cooperation just didn't happen. And that was an important factor leading up to the accident. So in that respect, flying has got much better, because that is obviously how it should be. And I remember going through a period in the mid-80s when this was coming in, where we'd all go off on courses and captains would be taught how to speak politely to first officers and to encourage them. So it was a definite teaching thing that came in the mid-80s, because people by then realised that it had a detrimental effect on safety otherwise.
Much of the classroom side of this course takes the form of seminars. Here, experienced pilots will hammer home important lessons, and is also a chance for the new recruits to learn from the wisdom of senior colleagues who have had a lifetime of flying experience to impart.
Dad was a pilot and just gone to work. And I was in the garden, I saw this aeroplane coming from a strange direction to Heathrow. And as it went past, it was Boeing 707 BAC. As it went past, it had like 100 feet of flame coming out of where the number 2 engine was. It was hardly making any noise because it was throttled right back, and it was landing on what was in those days 05 right at Heathrow. And when you see something like that, you just go, you kind of don't believe you're seeing it. How about 20 minutes later, the phone rang. My father, he said, I think I'm going to be a bit late tonight, the airport's shut. You haven't seen any burning aeroplanes, have you? I said, yeah, actually, it came right over the house. He said, yeah, I thought it might be. Anyway, I'm going to be late. I said, were they all right? Did they get out? He said, no, it burst into flames on the runway, and at that point, we didn't know. In actual fact, I think there were 5 fatalities. Everybody did manage to get out of the aircraft. They did quite a good job. But what had happened, the aircraft had taken off. In those days, it wasn't 27 right, it was 28. It'd taken off from this runway, 28 left, and it did a very quick circuit to land back on 5 right, and it was back on the ground in less than 2.5 minutes. The number 2 engine that had caught fire had been in and out of the engine shop, rejected, put on various aeroplanes, ended up, yeah, it's good enough, put on this aircraft, and it blew up on takeoff. It actually fell off into some gravel pits here, which is where Thorpe Park is now. And our house was about here, which is why when I saw an aeroplane come from there, I thought, that's unusual, and you watch it. What happened was, the engine failed, so the captain ordered the engine failure drill, which they started doing. And they'd done some of the items on the engine failure drill when they got a fire warning. Somebody quickly cancelled the fire warning, and the captain said, switch to the engine fire drill. They started the engine fire drill, but the critical fuel valve was not closed and was swapping from one checklist to another, which is why the fuel was still pouring out when it came over, well, on fire when it came past our house. And one of the recommendations from that was, why don't we combine the checklist? One of the stewardesses was killed. She was the only woman in peacetime to receive the George Cross posthumously. She did a fantastic job trying to get people out of the aircraft. And in a further connection, I went to school in Yorkshire. I went to Scarborough Boys High School. She gone to Scarborough Girls High School. So even closer connection, and there's a plaque. My sister lives in Scorby in Scarborough, and in the churchyard there's a commemoration plaque to her. So I have a lot of connections.
The practical part of this training is done in flight simulators, often of the type of plane they will fly for the first job as a first officer for an airline. Flight simulators have been in existence since some of the earliest commercial aircraft. Early flight simulators could be rather simple affairs.
This is something you've probably not seen before, Link Trainer. I last sat in one of these in 1973 while I was at Hamble. We were introduced to these at the end of our single engine flying before we started the twin engine flying, which then of course involved airways work and flying on instruments and approaches on instruments using ADFs and VORs and instrument landing systems.
Okay.
And this is a mini simulator which this hood would come over, the door would shut, so you're completely enclosed, and you would fly it like an aeroplane, but purely on instruments.
Right.
So it was a cheaper way of learning to fly on instruments than flying around in a twin-engined aeroplane. So I probably did about 30 hours on this back in 1973.
Really?
Yes.
That many?
Yes. Yes. Learning to fly instrument landing systems, learning to do a hold with the ADF radios, learning to fly VOR tracks and things like that. And then the instructor would throw in, it was quite sophisticated for its time, he could put a wind in to throw you off, so you'd have to allow for drift and things like that. And it did move, it would roll and tilt, so you did feel as though you were doing something. It was a bit sluggish, but we had fun.
I can imagine.
Others were developed from decommissioned aircraft, which were then modified so that the instructor could simulate all sorts of conditions and situations that could face pilots on real flights. Modern flight simulators are now fully computerized and use the same software as an actual aircraft. As a result, they are incredibly realistic. Not only do they give pilots a chance to learn how to fly a modern aircraft, they also allow trainee pilots to face all manner of emergency situations without ever leaving the ground. It means that dealing with, for instance, difficult crosswinds, equipment malfunction, bird strike, or even engine fire becomes second nature, so that in the unlikely event of one of these happening, the pilots are prepared to deal with it in a calm, efficient manner, even though they have never faced a situation in real life before.
Stop.
This side. Good, just if you want stopping.
Thank you.
Reverse fully normal, speed brake fully up.
Cabin crew at stations, please. Okay, state the malfunction, Sophie.
AP fired.
Okay, APU fire memory items.
Memory items.
Geneva Tower, virtual 221. We have indications of fire in the tail. Can you see anything from the tower, please?
Virtual 221, significant smoke and flames visible.
Okay, virtual 221, stand by. Okay, the tower said there's smoke and flames visible in the tower of the aircraft. We've still got indications.
We do.
I don't think it's safe to stay on board. What do you think?
I agree.
Okay, evacuation checklist.
Evacuation checklist.
Having completed their Airline Standards Pilots Multi-Crew course, our pilots are now one step away from their first position as a first officer with an airline. The last qualification they need is a type rating. With vehicles like the modern motor car, most models have very similar control systems. Once you have learned to drive one car, it's very simple to apply what you've learned so that you can drive almost any make or model. With your driving license, you can drive anything from a Mini Cooper to a Rolls-Royce with a single qualification. Commercial jet aircraft, however, are so complex and their control systems so variable that special training is required for each model of aircraft you want to fly. This is referred to as a type rating and is the last hurdle our trainees have to cross. Throughout their careers, pilots have to obtain type ratings for each new aircraft they wish to fly as it comes into service. Retired airline captain Dave Smith's flying career spanned 35 years, and in that time he obtained type ratings for 8 different aircraft, ranging from the Hawker Siddeley Trident to the Boeing B747-400. The design of every aircraft is different, and that also applies to the layout of controls. Automation and computerization has meant that the cockpit has changed out of all recognition in a single generation.
First thing coming in here I've noticed is this is all really, really different from what I fly now. I mean, a lot more seats. Everything I fly nowadays is all glass cockpits, a lot less analog needles and such.
Well, of course, the training, the basic training was the same, but then as part, as you know, of the type rating, then you learn all this. In the days when the Comet was flying, we'd have 2 pilots, we'd have a flight engineer taking care of that panel, and we'd have a navigator there who was doing the navigation, because there was no such thing as global satellite positioning systems or anything like that. The systems became easier because on these aeroplanes, as you know, it's dials for everything. Everything's linked. The throttles, the fuel cocks, the individual fuel cocks, they're all linked by pulleys and systems like that. You have to do them individually. As you appreciate on a modern aeroplane, if you have a fire, you press one button and it cuts off the electrics, the hydraulics, the fuel, and it shuts down the engine.
Okay.
On an aeroplane like this, then you have to close off the hydraulics, you have to close off the fuel cocks, the engineer has to juggle the electrics around and the air systems around, and it all takes time. So everything is modernised on a new aeroplane.
Okay.
Cockpits seem to be designed in a sort of scattergun effect. There'd be an engineer who would decide, this is the captain's side and I'll put the instruments like that. And that's the co-pilot's side, and I'll stick some over there, but the co-pilot doesn't have all the same instruments as the captain,
Yes.
and vice versa. There was no standardisation, and quite a lot of the time they would design a cockpit, they'd do some test flying and then go, oh, we need an instrument for that. Where shall we put it? Oh, well, we'll stick it up here, shall we? So it's not in the same place at all.
Okay.
And of course, with knobs and dials, it's difficult to reposition. If you've just got two blank screens and you decide you need a new instrument, you just reprogram the software and that instrument can appear on the screen in the same place. And then when you join the airline, then you would do what you do, your type rating course, so learning to fly the specific aeroplane. Nowadays it tends to be 10 days of ground school and depending on the level of experience, perhaps as little as 10 or 12 simulator sessions. When I did my first type rating course onto the Trident, the ground school lasted 3 months.
Really?
We learnt wiring diagrams and schematics of the fuels and the hydraulics. Actually, it was a bit pointless because you can't do anything about it in the air, but that was the way, and it was all chalk and talk on a blackboard. And then we'd do, then you'd do the line training, which could be 40, 50 sectors.
Okay. And on that front then, I've just noticed in here, I can't see any computers of any kind. I presume this all predates all that era.
This definitely predates any sort of computing power at all. The first ones that came in were probably on the jumbos in the middle 70s. At least they had some sort of computing power on their navigation systems when they brought in the inertial navigation system. But that was it. That was the only little bit of electronic equipment in terms of machinery with a chip.
Okay.
NASA 557, contact tower 128.15. Maintain spacing interval 90 seconds. No closer than 3 nautical miles.